Okay, so we'll get started for this evening. So welcome to everyone and thank you for coming along to this, which is our penultimate TETHYS seminar of the term, and it's focused on topics in planetary sciences. Once again, I want to extend my thanks to Safi for doing all of her hard work every week that she does to make sure that this seminar goes ahead. And so my name is Will as well, and I'm co-hosting it with Safi this evening. So the structure of the talk this evening is going to be, we'll have two speakers. Each of them will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, and then there'll be about 5 minutes for questions afterwards at the end of each talk. So if you want to ask questions during the seminar or wait to the end, just pop them in the chat and Safi will read them out after the end of the talk. And we also know that some people might not want to put questions in a group of people they don't know, so feel free to message Safi or myself and we can ask them for you anonymously as well. There's also a feedback survey in the chat, which has been really, really useful so far to get everyone's feedback. And if you want to continue, that'd be brilliant as we do go into planning for next term as well. So we are looking for speakers for next term. So if you do fancy giving it a go yourself, or you've done some really cool research that you want to share, then drop us a message either via email or Twitter or through the website. All of the links are in the chat already. And as we do look to kind of expand this project a little bit, we are hoping to maybe see one or two other people want to get involved on the logistical side of things as well. So if you do fancy kind of getting involved, it's not as much of a commitment thing, it's as much as you want to put into it. And contrary to Safi and myself, you can have normal coloured hair and get involved as well. We're not super discriminatory. So in terms of the serious bit, so the seminars, they're used to provide a platform for young geoscientists to present their research within a safe setting, independent of race, gender, religion, sexuality, or background. Any actions or comments which may be considered discriminatory, disrespectful, or compromise the safe and inclusive nature of the seminars are forbidden. And this extends to any comments during or after the seminar, during questions, feedback, or any social media posts linked to the seminar. And that's all I've got to say. So it's just for me to introduce our first speaker, who is Nikki Sridhar, who's now at Univ at Oxford, which is arguably the best college if you ask me, but did her master's research at Cambridge under Professor James Bryson, and is now working with James Bryson at Oxford as part of her PhD. So Nikki, if you want to share your screen and begin your talk.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Right. Working? All good? Yeah, okay, awesome. So yeah, like Will said, my name's Nikki and I'm going to talk about my master's project where I was looking at aqueous alteration of meteorites. So I did this at Cambridge with James Bryson, Ashley King and Rich Harrison. James is now at Oxford, Rich is at Cambridge and Ashley's at the Natural History Museum, and they're all great people to kind of talk to or get into contact with if you're interested in planetary science or magnetism. So just thought I'd put that there. So if anyone wants to do that in the future, you know where to go. So not sure how much people have done in planetary science. So I thought I'd give a little bit of a background. So I looked at meteorites, but I guess in general, like what is a meteorite? Because we know that it's a space rock, right? Comes from outer space, flies in, we find it on Earth, really cool, really interesting. But there's actually a lot more to them than just a cool rock from outer space. So there are lots of different types of meteorite, and this is where it gets really interesting. So I've just put 3 up on the screen. The one on the left is something we called palisite, and it's really, really cool. So the things that you can see through are these big kind of gem quality olivine crystals, and it's surrounded by a matrix of metal, which is really interesting. And there's loads of different ways that we think that these are formed. Some people, well, currently the thought is that it's when 2 giant kind of protoplanets, or not so giant, reasonably sized protoplanets collide, and you've got mantle and core mixing, and you get this really interesting quality. So those are really cool. The one on the top right is just metal. So it's an iron nickel metal iron meteorite, and those are thought to be formed from the core of planets. So when this small planetesimal breaks up, you've got this iron meteorite that then somehow finds its way to the Earth. So those 2 are really cool sorts of meteorites, arguably really pretty to look at. And they're really cool because they come from planetesimals that have differentiated. And when I say differentiated, I mean they've had enough heating on their parent body so that they segregate into a metal core and a liquid molten silicate mantle, which is like what the Earth is today. Apart from those, there are also other meteorites which are completely different because they are undifferentiated. So they haven't undergone this process of heating and melting and segregation, and they are called chondrites. So these are the ones that I looked at, and it's what's shown in the bottom right-hand image, so over here. So what is a chondrite? Basically, it's almost like a sedimentary rock in terms of a meteorite. So it's just formed out of loads of different things that condense really early out of the solar system, out of the protoplanetary disk, and they all aggregate and stick together and form this really kind of fissile, like brittle rock. So they look kind of unremarkable when you hold them. So they don't have the pretty textures of the other two that we saw, but they're still really interesting. And what I've just put there is a photo of a protoplanetary disk, an image taken by a telescope. So this is a real one, not an artist representation. And it's in this sort of setting that we think that these chondrites form. So what is in a chondrite? So when they accumulate material, when they all coalesce, you've got lots of different components that go into your chondrites. And some of them are chondrules, which I've kind of pointed out here. They're these rounded spherical kind of globules that are molten in the solar system, and then when they cool down, they cool in the shape of the sphere, and you get loads of kind of silicate minerals in them and metal and loads of like olivines and pyroxenes you can find in them. And then you get this squiggly things called refractory inclusions. My mouse has stopped working. Oh, there you go, over here. So this is a CAI, calcium aluminium inclusion. So they're really rich in refractory elements. You've got metal, which I've just pointed to in general in a place, but you find it in the chondrules, in the matrix of the meteorite. And you also have ice. So ice accretes alongside all these different minerals to form a really big parent body. So this is actually an image of Ryugu, which is also a type, we think is also a chondrite that exists in the solar system today. And this is actually an image of where the Japanese Space Agency sent a mission to collect samples from. So we'll actually get samples from this chondrite body later this year. I think in December is when it should come back. But this is just putting it into context. So a meteorite that you see falling from the sky comes from a body like this. It's just kind of broken off, lands on Earth, and then what you see is what we saw in the first images. So this is the part where my project comes in, because all's well and good, everything's accreted. And when this parent body heats up a little bit, not so much so that it differentiates and the metal separates out, but it'll heat up just enough so that the ice melts. And when this ice melts, you'll get a fluid on your parent body. What this fluid does is it then reacts with everything else that's already in the meteorite, and it forms lots of new minerals, lots of really interesting ones to look at. And those include stuff like phyllosilicates, magnetite, iron sulfides, carbonates, and a lot more. And they're all really cool to look at. So what I did in my project is I investigated these minerals that are formed via aqueous alteration, but more specifically, I used magnetism to do it. So to do that, obviously you have to look at some magnetic minerals, right? And so for that, what I focused on was the magnetite and the sulfides. So that's what my project was. This is, we basically did this instead of the other things, is just because we wanted a new way of investigating aqueous alteration on these bodies, because it's a really interesting process, but like we don't understand these bodies so much. We know what's in them, but we don't know much about their history or how they accreted or the processes that occurred on their bodies. And so we wanted to find a kind of niche, different way of investigating this process of aqueous alteration. And we know that magnetite forms during this process, and we can see that it forms these really weird and unusual shapes that I'll show you in a bit. So that was the whole kind of basis of this project. So this is the methods bit. This is the bit that's kind of complicated. definitely don't worry if you don't follow and you still don't understand what any of these diagrams are at the end of it. It's okay, it's a short talk. You probably won't. So in general, what I did was I had these meteorites and I had them as powders. So I didn't even have them as like big rocks, which is a bit disappointing, but it's okay. But I had them as powders, and all I did was I kind of stuck them down so that they're solid and don't move around as much. I put them in a big machine, not too big, about me size, about 5'2", if you give you a bit of context, and then you switch on a big magnet, and all I had to do was kind of measure the response, the magnetic response that my samples had to an applied field. And when you do that, you can kind of note down what the response is, and a very smart computer program will process that response, and then it'll spit out these images that you can see on the right. So these are called fork diagrams. So fork stands for first order reversal curves. You don't really need to understand that much. But basically, these diagrams are a way of investigating the properties of the magnetic minerals in your sample. So they're really good because they can tell you what the magnetic minerals are in your sample. They can tell you how big they are, and they can try and give you some information about the morphology of those minerals as well. So like the shapes that they come in. And then the words I have here, I'm just going to move Will out of the way in case you can see him. Single domain, multi-domain, vortex state, and this, which are basically descriptions of how big the magnetite is. So I've just put it here. So single domain is like a relatively small bit of magnetite. Vortex state magnetite is slightly bigger, as you can see by the size range, and multi-domain grains are even bigger. So these diagrams are specific to different sizes and shapes. That's the only thing I wanted to get across here. And they're really powerful tools. And there hasn't been like a study of the magnetite in meteorites before done, like a comprehensive study done using this technique. So that's why we wanted to do it, to fill a gap. So it's also good because it can identify the minerals in your sample that you couldn't tell were there before via traditional processing stuff like SEM. So you can't really see some of these really small magnetite grains in SEM imaging, but you can identify that they're there using this magnetic technique, which is why it's really good. So all in all, I looked at I measured 4 different sorts of subgroups of chondrites. And by that, it just basically means that meteorites that fall within one subgroup, we think that they come from parent bodies that had similar chemical properties like an isotope signatures. So I basically looked at 4 different groups of meteorites just to look at how aqueous alteration changes between them and within them. So for one of them, these CM meteorites, I had loads of samples, and some were really altered and some were altered to a little amount. So I also looked at like how magnetite changes through changing amounts of aqueous alteration. So that's what the project basically was. So these are some of my results. So it's a lot of fork diagrams. Don't worry if you don't understand them. I've just put like what they basically be that you have to take out from it by the sides. So starting off, even before that, yeah, I'll show you what some of the magnetite looks like. So I also took some FCM images of the magnetite. So you can see what they look like, and then you can put like a picture to a name when I talk about them later on about what I found. So in the CM chondrites, so this is the group where I had loads of samples, you can see here that magnetite exists in really, really small grains, like submicron in the matrix. It was really hard to identify these in SEM, which just like goes to show how useful fork diagrams are later for identifying these. And they're really, really tiny. And this is one, CM 1.5 means that it's like, this one is less aqueously altered than this one. The numbers are kind of a scale for the alteration grade. It's not that important, don't worry about it. But basically this one is a bit more aqueously altered, and you can see you've got larger grains of magnetite that are like micron to 5 micron scale, in size, and they also are forming around this metal grain. So this is one of the ways that magnetite forms. It forms from alteration of metal, and it also forms from alteration of sulfides. So here, these are kind of small individual grains of magnetite. And in the CI chondrites, this is where you get the fun grains. So these are called framboids. I think it's named framboid after like raspberry, which is frambios? I don't know the name, but they look like raspberries. So each of these is a small single grain of magnetite that's clumped together to form this well-structured thing called a framboid. And you've also got these things called plaquettes, which are individual discs of magnetite that are kind of all stuck together like this. So you get these really unusual forms of magnetite in these CI chondrites. So that's what we see in the SEM. So now, what do we see in the fork diagrams? So these are now the magnetic measurements that I made. This is only 4 of them. I took a load more, but what you can already see from this is you've got kind of a range of fork diagrams, right? So that represents that I have a range of morphologies of magnetite within these CM chondrites. And from the left to the right, I'm going from here is the least aqueously altered ones, and here are the most. So you can see that there's difference between the least and the most, and then the fork diagrams are different. So at least qualitatively, I can say that my magnetite is changing based on amount of aqueous alteration. And it's changing from smaller grains to larger grains. This is just what the fork diagrams mean in terms of what they represent in terms of like morphology of magnetite that we already know. The next are one of the other groups, a CO chondrite. So they have this, again, it's called a pirate hat shape or signal. So we've got this signal of magnetite. We see it in both of the ones that I looked at. This is a bit of a crappy fork, but it's still like reasonably good in terms of how forks go. And it also shows that we've got magnetite of this kind of vortex state, which is just basically saying we've got magnetite in this size range in this meteorite, isolated, which means that it's not framboids or plaquettes. So those are not isolated grains. And then I've got, these are the last 2 groups that I looked at, the CI chondrites and a C2 chondrite. And the main thing to take away is it looks different from the others. It's got this really big triangular shape, and it's really spread out along the y-axis. So this is another distinctive kind of shape of the fork diagram, which represents these clustered small grains of magnetite. So this is a signal that represents a framboid. So from the fork diagrams, we're seeing things that match what we see in the SEM, just because we know this is what you see when you look at framboids, and we're seeing the framboids, everything's matching up. So all of this is kind of qualitative, because I've just been saying, oh, look, I've measured a fork diagram, it shows this, maybe it changes with increased aqueous alteration, and maybe it changes between groups. And that's all well and good, but it's much better to have this like quantitatively shown. So what we did after this was use a software, or we used an analysis that's called principal component analysis, which is where a software basically unpicks the components of things and splits up your diagrams into an array. It basically unmixes components. I guess the best analogy is if you gave it a range of coffees that you'd made, some with more water, some with less water, some with more milk, less milk, sugar, espresso, it would basically be able to unmix that and tell you how much of each component you'd have in it. That's basically what I did for all my diagrams. And the good thing is that it has no preconceived notion about what should go into each diagram. So whatever the variation is described by each axis, it means nothing to the computer. So the computer is purely just looking at these diagrams and picking out whether things look alike or different, and how alike and how different they're meant to look from each other. So that's like the really basic explanation of it. So it's a really powerful tool just to look at similarities and differences between diagrams. So I fed all my diagrams into it and asked it to pick out kind of similarities and differences and group my things together just to show quantitatively that what I saw qualitatively was true. And long story short, it did. So the ones in this green circle are one group of chondrite, and the ones in the corner where it's labeled like interacting SD vortex is another. So these are the C2 chondrites that look like a triangle shape like this. And these are the CM chondrites that looked more like this. So it's telling me, yes, like they're different, correct. You've got a range in your CM chondrites and you've got C2 chondrites that plot differently. And then when you include the other one, the CI chondrite, that also had a triangle shape, it's just very faint here. So you're going to just believe it's a triangle, it is there. But the CM chondrites here also plot completely separate to those ones. So what you're seeing is the CM chondrites show magnetite that's totally different from the CI and C2 chondrites. And this analysis that I've done to the diagrams that I've found and measured also agrees with that. So it's saying like, yes, you're right, it's not something that you're imagining, they do plot separately. So that was kind of the nitty gritty of the results that I got from my analysis. And then the fun part was actually trying to think, okay, so I've seen this now, what does this actually mean? And this is putting it all into context, in the terms of like, what does this mean for aqueous alteration on my meteorite parent body? Like what actually happened? So from this, what we can basically tell is that aqueous alteration happened in two different ways, because the magnetite that you're forming is so different in both different meteorite classes. So in one form, you're just getting normal small grains of magnetite, nothing fancy about them, nothing interesting, they just maybe change shape a little bit. So that's why you get a bit of variation between them. But in the other meteorites, you're getting these really funky grains of framboids and plaquettes. And we can see like quantitatively now that, yeah, that is true. You've got two different alteration pathways. So then you go on to ask, so why? Like, why are you getting two different alteration pathways? What's so different between one situation in one parent body that means that magnetite forms in a certain way compared to the other? So this was like the real tail end of the project, which is actually stuff that I didn't finish when I was doing my master's project. So this is not all the scope of one project. It is also like work that I've been doing now. To just give you a bit of time scale wise. So what we did was we looked in the literature, because I'm not a geochemist, James is not a geochemist, Rich is not a geochemist. We don't really have that background, but what we can do is look at what other people have said and done and seen and reported about these meteorites. So it's easier to tell you what it's not, as in what the reason isn't for these different aqueous alteration pathways. So we went through and we systematically looked at the conditions on all of these meteorites to do with how much they've been weathered on Earth, how much heating they'd undergone, how much aqueous alteration they'd undergone, how much ice they initially had, the organics that they had to begin with, what they started off with in their original mineralogy. And we can say that there's no systematic variation in these with relation to the presence and absence of these weird morphologies of magnetite. So we know it's not any of these, but the thing that we think it is possibly the ice composition. So the actual fluid that is causing the aqueous alteration to begin with. And this kind of links into other research that's been done and shown in the field, because recently people have reported that to form these framboids and to have them to be stable, you need alkaline conditions. And this is because you need to be able to support these cations on the surface of each of these framboids, which means that the magnetite doesn't just decide to all stick together into one massive grain of magnetite, but can stay as these small little grains that are all tessellated into this framework. So that's one part of evidence. You need alkaline conditions. And a way to get alkaline conditions is to have your ice, the fluid, be slightly alkaline. And a good way to do that is to have ammonia in your ice. And so that's where another study comes in. So this was a different study to do with how molecules condense out of the solar nebula, so like the order in which they condense. And so we know that water ice condenses out at like around 160 Kelvin, and this translates in terms of like a disk situation to a certain distance away, because when you're near the sun, you're hotter. When you're further away from the sun, you're cooler. So there's a certain temperature at which, that distance at which you're 160 Kelvin, and further away from that, you can condense ice. So all of these chondrites must have condensed kind of further away from that, so you've got ice on them. And then it's also related to time, but that's slightly different. We're going to kind of assume that they're all accreted at the same time. So after ice, which condenses at 160 Kelvin, the next one to condense at like astrophysically relevant quantities, and quantities that are relevant to changing like bulk composition of ice on your meteorite, is ammonia. So that's the next one that comes out. It's a totally separate study, so it's really nice to link the two of them. So this study suggests that ammonia condenses out at 90 Kelvin, which is further away from the sun, because hotter closer, cooler further away. So this is the hotter temperature, this is the cooler temperature. So further away, you've got an ammonia snowline as well. So any meteorite or any parent body that accretes further away and past the snowline will have ammonia on it. So it'll have ammoniated ice. So tentatively, what this means is that chondrites that we see that have magnetite accreted at further distances past this ammonia snowline. And we see this because we see that they have framboids. These framboids require alkaline conditions. The way that we get the alkaline conditions is this ammoniated ice. And to get this ammoniated ice, you need to be far away from the sun, and you need to be past a certain like temperature range, which kind of puts a spatial separation on these chondrite formation distances, which is really nice because this is something that is kind of hard to quantify in any other way, like the actual location of formation of these chondrites. So from like looking at one grain, like magnetite, using like magnetism, we managed to kind of link it into the formation of the actual parent body, which I know it's like a long kind of convoluted process, but it's a really nice conclusion and something really interesting. So yeah, so maybe we know where these meteorites were accreting in the solar nebula, which is this disk, which is really interesting. So I'll just put the conclusions up there, so if you wanted to read over them. But basically, in general, magnetite forms in aqueous alteration, and the size may vary based on like the amount of aqueous alteration that a meteorite has undergone. And also magnetite forms through two separate pathways depending on which chondrite parent body you're on, and that's determined by like where you accrete in the disk. So that's basically TLDR. It's some accrete further away and they've got framboids, and some accrete closer and they don't have framboids. So that's it. I know that was very long and probably very complicated, but if you have any questions to do with like just formation of magnetite or just planetary science in general, or magnetism, like you can drop them in the chat or ask them at any point. But yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks for that, Nikki. That was great magnetism revision for me, at least. So yeah, if anybody has any quick questions, just put them in the chat and then I'll read them out.
Saf, whilst we're waiting for the ones in the chat, can I quickly ask, you kind of have a numerical scale on the degree of alteration of different meteorites in the samples, and I was just wondering how you got a kind of quantitative measure of the degree of alteration, what the process was for that?
Yeah, so that's actually something that I didn't do, but so do you know how I mentioned it right at the beginning that you get phyllosilicates also from aqueous alteration? So what people do is they kind of, using XRD, they find out how much phyllosilicate is present in a meteorite matrix, and then based on the amount of phyllosilicate present, they give it an alteration grade. So between 3 to 1 is like the scale of how aqueously altered a meteorite is. So 3 is like the most pristine, not aqueously altered, and 1 is most aqueously altered. But then it gets confusing because above 3 goes like 3 to 6, and that's to do with thermal alteration. So it's kind of half the scale is to do with aqueous alteration, half is thermal. So I didn't calculate it, it's just known from studies of XRD beforehand.
Oh, we have a question from Peter, who said, you mentioned that there were also iron sulfides present in chondrites. Do they appear as a separate component in the fork diagrams, or is the signal from the magnetite overwhelming them?
Yes, that's a really good question, and also something that's a bit annoying. So iron sulfides are also magnetic, and so they could also contribute towards the magnetic signal that you measure in the fork diagrams. We don't think that the fork diagrams are showing this, because I've been doing a bit of work on this now as well. But iron sulfides, they're normally like 5 times less, they contribute 5 times less to the magnetic signal than magnetite does for the same kind of volume percent. But also not every iron sulfide present is magnetic, so you can get non-magnetic iron sulfides too. So we're not even sure how much of the iron sulfide present there is contributing to the signal, but we don't think that what we're seeing is due to them. Like, we think they're probably definitely due to the magnetite. I guess more troublesome would be if there was metal contributing to the signal, because metal is really magnetic. But we don't think that's happening to like a really big extent, because when you do other magnetic measurements, you can kind of pick out what you think is which minerals are contributing to the signal. And it looks like magnetite is the main one. So we're not too worried about metal or iron sulfides, but that is like definitely something to think about.
And now we have a question from Ursula, who says, your principal component diagrams, you have a dozen outliers. How did you decide on your end members, if you remember?
Yeah, so there are a few outliers, but sometimes that's more to do with just the quality of the fork diagram, because if it's bad, it's just not going to fit really nicely into this PCA. So we actually chose the end members based on physically realistic fork diagrams. So you could have put, I don't know if it's easy to just, if I share my screen again, can I do that? So I could have put these end members anywhere, but the forks that they would make wouldn't be physically realistic. So what we tried to do is we tried to put the end members near points, because we know that they're physically realistic because we're seeing these measurements, but also in positions where you could realistically get a fork. And what determines a physically realistic fork is basically down to the hysteresis loop that is like generated by the program at these points. So there are certain parameters that you can like match to make sure that what you're generating is realistic. So it's just to do with the shape of the hysteresis loop. But yeah, so we just decided it kind of qualitatively, not quantitatively, if that makes any sense. Okay, yeah.
So I think in the interest of time, we'll move on to our second speaker now, just to make sure that we can fit everything in. But if there's any more questions for Nikki, then do pop them in the chat, and hopefully we can have some time at the end. I'm sure Nikki will be happy to answer all of those. So our second speaker is Hassan Sheikh, who did his undergrad at Manchester University and then went on to a master's at Cambridge under Professor Richard Harrison, and is now staying on at Cambridge and is doing his PhD with Richard Harrison. So Hassan, if you want to give us a bit of a talk on, I think, what is it, Apollo samples? That'd be fun.
Yeah, thank you. Just gonna share my screen. So just before I start, I know the the format of my presentation is very similar to Nikki's, but I didn't copy hers. So yeah, so I'm just going to talk about what I did for my master's project. I know there are a range of students with different backgrounds over here, so I wouldn't get into details. So the samples I looked at were two samples. One of them was a coarse-grained lunar sample from Apollo 17. It's called 70017, not relevant, but one of them was the fine-grained ones. So why do we need to look at lunar samples is because like the Earth's magnetic field, the moon used to have one as well. But around 1 billion years ago, it ceased to exist. So why did it cease to exist? And if it existed, what were the mechanisms that were happening at that time that gave a certain paleo field, which we did collect from the samples. And the questions we were trying to answer were that the lunar samples we've been getting from the moon, are they reliable? Are they giving us a reliable paleomagnetic measurements? By magnetic measurements, I mean, were they not like to rule out any possibility that they could have been magnetized maybe when we were bringing them from the moon through the space shuttle, or any other shock magnetization event. Second thing which I wanted to answer was, why are there differences in the magnetic recording properties of lunar samples? So some of the samples, they do show certain characteristics. They have certain magnetic characteristics, which makes them more of a good magnetic recorder. That is, they preserve the field, preserved a history of a magnetic field which was present, while some of them are bad magnetic recorders. So what makes them good or bad recorders? There are certain textural and chemical features. So we all know the moon no longer possesses a magnetic field, and the mechanisms. There has been a big debate on what were the possible mechanisms that drove the lunar dynamo, and we all know that this is a question which is very relevant for exoplanetary research as well, where if we need to find life, having a magnetic field is one of the things which does kind of facilitates a habitable planet. So it facilitates habitability. So there are 4 mechanisms which are kind of like were presented about the lunar dynamo, and 4 of them contradict each other. So this diagram here kind of tells us that around 4 billion years ago, 4.5 billion years ago, when there was a giant moon forming impact, the third body, when the Earth, when there was an impact between the Earth and the moon, the Earth became more iron rich and the moon became more iron poor. So we can kind of hypothesize or kind of tell that it could be that the iron rich part of that planetary body came into the Earth, and the iron poor part of the silicate part went into the moon. And so there have been lots of studies done. You see these black dots. These are basically actual samples which have been taken from the moon over several years, several missions. And one certain thing you would realize would be that around 4 billion years ago, you can see the paleo intensity was quite high. And then after 1 billion years, or within a time frame of a few million years, you can see it just came down like by an order of magnitude, by a lot. And we have not been able to explain why has that been the case. And around 1 billion years ago, it has now been kind of like a recent study to tell that the field ceased to exist. So different mechanisms. One of them is a thermochemical convection model, where they say that it's unlikely that the convection drove this magnetic field for the moon because of the high paleo field measurements we got over here. And several studies have suggested that it could be an unknown mechanism which is not known to us until now. One interesting mechanism which I would want to talk about is the mechanical stirring of the core. It's basically how the inner core, the differential stirring between the inner core and the outer mantle, when the Earth's because of Earth's precession on the lunar spin axis, kind of stirs the core of the moon, which could have generated this dynamo at this point. But as the moon moved away from the Earth, this kind of maybe, went down the measurements. So the aims were that the samples were investigated, some paleofield measurements were done at MIT, and then I got these samples, and there were 2 of them, and then there were subsamples. So basically had to assess their chemical and textural differences, and also their magnetic characterization, basically. So I used an SEM similar to what Nikki used. It can tell us about textural and also topographical information of the sample we study. And then we also used a 3D X-ray CT scan, which kind of, through using that, we kind of basically scanned a rock sample throughout, and then did like a slice tomography technique, which I will discuss later. And this is the big magnet machine, which Nikki did mention. It is called an AGM, which can give us hysteresis measurements, basically can tell a lot about the magnetic properties of a certain sample. And we can also do those first order reversal curves, which are basically a set of hysteresis measurements over some certain time steps. And yeah, I also used PCA technique to reduce the samples, the chemical phases present, and created phase masks so that could differentiate different chemical phases present. This is just a meme about how NMF, which is one of the techniques, did a better job than PCA. So yeah, petrological description, I wouldn't go into it. There were some really cool minerals present. This texture you see in the background is one of the fine-grained ones. So this is a very fine-grained matrix you see over here, and there were magnetic metallic iron grains present, which are not visible at this scale, but I would show you later on. So this was the coarse grain sample. You can see a very distinct X solution texture over here, which is basically when two minerals are intergrowing into each other. Some cool minerals present in over here as well. This is chromium X solution. You can see the purple grains over here, purple lines. So I did quantitative analysis, bunch of minerals present, compared it with previous studies. Wouldn't go into it because it's not really relevant. You can see the quartz grains usually had a very distinct rhombohedral shape, and so did the ilmenites by these spin effects or these longitudinal, kind of grains you see on top of the matrix. So this is the data from SEM. You can see the different elements present within certain minerals. So this is the most important bit of the research, where the iron grains present were giving the magnetic signal, and they were present as inclusions within iron sulfide. This was the fine grained one sample. You can see the scale over there, around, this would be around 3-4 microns. And then this was the coarse grained sample. And this is like a machine learning approach where I used Python to separate different phases, and you can see, because of the different brightness thresholds of the minerals present, of the phases present, we could get certain phases separated as binary. So you can tell this is iron sulfide, the white one. This was ilmenite, some pretty cool stuff. Could separate the iron peaks. So this was correlated later on with the QDM, which I'll show you. So yeah, so this is the data from 3D tomography, and this was another main primary part of the project, where the heterogeneity present within the samples of iron carriers was quite distinct. As you can see, these red distinct, discrete iron grains were heterogeneously distributed. This is another image of how this is a kind of a multi kind of segmentation of the same iron particles, but different colors. I think the yellow one, the blue one, are the ones which are smaller in grain size, and then it's over a spectrum of grain sizes. So yeah, so QDM is basically a technique where it can tell you about the magnetic carriers present in the samples. This was done at Harvard, but it was brought over to Cambridge, and then I correlated the magnetic dipoles with the SEM images to see where the signals were coming from. And it is just correlated here. You can see the iron grain in red was giving this out of plane magnetic signal in red. Won't go over this. Hysteresis loops, won't go into details, but they can tell us about how much magnetization is present, is kind of present after a magnetic field is removed. So that is called the remnant, the MR. And then we can also tell about the coercivity when we bring the field to change the field's direction to a -1. Unimportant diagrams. My hysteresis loops and forks were a mess because they were very noisy, and the core signal, the signal showed a very coarse grain size. And you would remember from Nikki's diagrams that this looks very similar to a multi-domain signature for 70017. DCD curves, won't get into them. I would actually jump to, so was there evidence of primary magnetization? So the chemical, characterization I did, it didn't really show up anything for any shock magnetization or any alteration, but there is still a possibility that there could be a S-shock remnant magnetization, which overprints a primary one without any alteration. Going to conclusions, the heterogeneity within the samples, with how heterogeneously the iron grains were distributed, can tell us about how the paleointensity measurements, when done at different labs, could produce different results, but that doesn't mean, that does also kind of reinforces that the high paleofield data we have from lunar samples is not incorrect. So yeah, I would like to thank Professor Rich, who's my supervisor, and also Farhan, Claire, and Mary for their help in this project. And yeah, so this is just, it's an animation. I don't know why it's not working, but yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Hassan. So yeah, again, if anybody has any questions, put them in the chat. And also you can send them to me and then I won't read your name out if you want to be anonymous.
Seth, can I kick off by asking about so you mentioned at the end the shock remnant magnetism couldn't be ruled out. And are you saying that as something that would have happened to the samples whilst they were kind of on the moon? And if so, what would be causing that shock remnant magnetism?
So between 4 billion years ago, when the moon, 4.5 billion years ago, when the moon actually formed, and up till now, there have been a lot of impact craters on the moon. So those asteroids hitting the moon could potentially have caused that SRM, and not it could be that, or when we brought the samples through the space to Earth, it could be magnetization from that and an overprint. But one of the samples, the 70215, it did show the high coercivity component of that, did show an origin trending high coercivity component, which is kind of a way of telling that the sample did have primary magnetization, but that wasn't shown by the other sample. So it's kind of, you can still not rule out the shock remnant magnetization because we just have a few samples to look at, and yeah, our sample size wasn't too big.
Cool, thank you.
Okay, so someone asks, why was non-negative matrix factorization better than PCA?
So NMF technique actually gives you, oh, there's another question by Lara. So NMF is a very similar technique to PCA. It does pretty much the same job, but when it produces the spectra of elements, you would have seen that different elements have a certain counts. It gives a positive spectra. For PCA, it doesn't do the same. So it kind of gives you a positive spectra for that, and it does a pretty good job in kind of segmenting the phases itself as well than PCA.
Okay, and Lara asks, what do you think the most likely explanation is for the moon losing its magnetic field? And did this change over the course of your project?
The explanation for this thing, or the explanation of, or for the mechanism, or for the abatement of the thing? Let me loses my hand, did this change over the course? So the idea of the moon having a magnetic field in the first instance, the mechanism which actually caused it is not very well known. There have been papers saying it was an unknown mechanism, or there was this stirring mechanism which I mentioned. And in that case, in the mechanical stirring of the moon, so because the moon, because of the Earth's precession over the moon's spin axis, the distance of the moon from the Earth has been increasing, that could have reduced this thing. That is one of the explanation which could have caused this thing. But then again, that means we have to agree on the mechanism at the first place, which is widely disputed itself. Yeah. I think that's
Okay, fantastic. So thank you, Hassan, and thank you, Nikki, as well. Thank you both for two really interesting talks. And if there are any more questions, do pop them in the chat really quickly before we finish, and I'm sure Safi can read them. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone for coming along as well. And there is at the top of the chat somewhere, I'll copy it into the bottom as well, just for everyone else's ease. There's a feedback form there if you guys want to get involved and give us some feedback, either for myself and Safi on how the seminar is run, or for either of the speakers, then that would be really appreciated. And just to let you know that next week we do have one more seminar this term, which is looking into seismology. It's topics in seismology. It's looking to be really good, though I am quite biased towards seismology. So if that's your thing as well, then do come along. And hopefully we'll get to see you all there. If not, then thank you guys for coming along this evening. If you kind of missed any of our previous talks, or if you want to watch this one again because you loved it so much, then we have got a YouTube channel up and running now. So if you can go through to our website, and then you can click on the YouTube link there and find all of our previous seminars on there as well. But otherwise, thanks again to Nikki and to Hassan for their talks, and thank you all for coming along, and hopefully we'll see you for our last talk next week.